That fruit vendor set himself a private fire, and in a few days the president got on gas. Up creative man, the ruler across a whole region, in weeks. Just one man. Just one act changed everything. Because of this, protests can stir the globe. Throughout the annals of history, those individuals like you and I have gone into the streets and sent kings, presidents, and entire governments down on their knees. They have passed laws making it impossible for large numbers of people to continue living. But here is a curious thing. Most protests fail. They are crushed, forgotten, or simply not listened to. Yet one ring in the fireman can start an avalanche of popular feeling that no man is able to stand against. What is the difference? Why do some protests fail, while others pick an X causes that literally change the world? That is what we are going to look at today. December 17, 2010. Mohamed Bouazizi was 26 years old and destitute in Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. A graduate of university, he had no work, so he carried fruit in a pushcart on the street. The police confiscated the cart that day, and because he was not licensed himself for it, they also took his livelihood. They insulted him, slapped him. When he complained at the governor's office, they refused to see him there. So Bouazizi walked back to that same office and doused himself with petrol, dropping a match. 2 months ago, a flow of people and goods linked the two countries, and this autumn, to live in each other countries. And in North Korea, many people are also beginning to move south. This is one of Asia's typical strengths as an economic market. A kind of abundance which resembles Europe's Great Valleys. With a huge population and the potential energy of its hundreds of millions of people, it must still take advantage. Sun Yat-sen, China, in its developed process of increasingly greater freedom and prosperity, has become a major market for hungry foreign businessmen. The South Koreans are finding that hard work will bring a high standard of living. At present, South Korea has a growth rate around 9%. This is the envy of the world's countries. The rulers of the North. What South Korea has made there sells well. More than 1 billion people work within an easy day's striking distance. This text from an interview with Yoo Mi-hun. Is it possible to be heard? Naive and real oppressed people say that the authorities always turn a deaf ear to their just appeal. However, protests do not succeed simply because people are angry. Research found that all around the world, larger numbers also matter for success. Or at least it's a necessary condition first, and they matter a lot. The 1963 March on Washington attracted 250,000 people to promote civil rights. At the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Later, they met with President Kennedy. Within 3 years, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. Why was this successful? Because the movement had been building up over years. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. The Montgomery bus boycott continued for 381 days. Students sat at segregated lunch counters until businesses were forced to desegregate. By 1963, the country was ready to listen. Second, peaceful protests are more effective than violent ones. Research that looked at every major uprising in the world from 1945 to 2014 found a surprising thing. Non-violent campaigns were much more successful at creating large-scale political change than violent ones. Why? First, because violence makes people regard protesters as dangerous. On the other hand, non-violent actions, especially such as disruptive or mass protests which change the normal order of things, create pressure for change and still keep up public sympathy. In 1965, when the civil rights activists hoped to march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights, they were stopped by police who beat them with clubs at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. When these images showed on TV, the nation was appalled. President Lyndon Johnson promised a voting rights bill. Just 2 weeks later, the protesters tried again. This time they were guarded by federal agents and made it through fine. The Voting Rights Act became law in August of that year. The violence did not come from them. It came from whoever was trying to stop them. And that made all the difference in the world. In 2020, people took to the streets for what were probably the largest protests in American history. For more than 9 minutes, a Minneapolis police officer named Derek Chauvin with the knee heavily on his neck as Floyd didn't gasp for air and couldn't even speak. Passers-by captured everything on video. It quickly went viral, and protest actions broke out in all 50 states. At least 15 to 26 million Americans demonstrated just how various these demonstrations were. Few such large recent protests have included altogether different levels and kinds of people. The protests spread to every continent. Question: did anything change? In fact, yes. Dozens of states took up new police reform laws within the next few months. At least 30 states banned or restricted chokeholds altogether. Many made it so that officers had to report excessive force and intervene if they saw one on scene. Cities slashed police budgets and moved funds into community programs. A consent decree that will force Minneapolis to make major changes in how it polices now was mandated for the city where Floyd died. Dallas brought in a duty to intervene policy. Austin took $150 million from its police budget. New Orleans said that before firing bullets, officers must first try every de-escalation method in the book. Of course, the changes weren't perfect. Some of them have since been reversed. But the protests did achieve genuine and concrete results. Take, for example, the 20 million Americans who participated in a form of public protest back on Earth Day 1970, which demanded that laws be passed to protect and take care of the environment. Well, would you know it, by the end of that year, Congress had adopted both Clean Air and Clean Water Acts? What's more, it had done this land while preserving all the endangered species living in it from extinction. And back in 1970, before the year was out, Congress had created America's Environmental Protection Agency as well. However, not every protest sees success. The 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement had attracted a huge following to protest economic inequality. But in time, as mentioned above, it failed to drive through even one big policy change. Where did it all go wrong? Research shows that protests must have clear targets and pressure must go on in order to succeed. Occupy had neither of these things. The movement had no concrete goals, and as people lost interest in it, it went away. Other factors made it inevitable that the radical protests should eventually lose public support. The students had specific requests. They hoped would make background checks more stringent. In addition to restricting sale of certain types of magazines and increasing to 21 years old minimum age for purchase of firearms, it was not just politicians the students lobbied. They also began to register voters. And when you quit with one march, the other won't be over. In Florida, the state enacted the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act, which raises age limit for purchasing a gun to 21 and installation period before you can purchase an assault rifle. Whether success or failure ultimately lies in organization, clear aims, or another factor, one thing's for sure: without giving up hope, there'll never be happiness. So how do protests change the world? They plunge society into attention for things it was ignoring. Protests are also a kind of pressure that can't be overlooked. Whenever enough people gather together, they will refuse to remain silent, and they must ask better things of life. At that time, the government simply couldn't help but hear them. When Mohamed Bouazizi died most horribly, he couldn't possibly have realized that dictators from one end of an entire region would be overthrown. However, Rosa Parks and her refusal, commitment to those deeds of nonviolent protest, which put an end to scripted segregation, could hardly have known how history was changed. The brave young men and women marching in Selma were probably unaware just what their simple act of valor might mean for the future. But they did have one thing in common. They refused to sit back and take things quietly. Protests that have truly rocked the world are remembered only because they were strong. Nor is it the ability or brains people possess that is really what matters. But there must be some other form of activity, if it does not want history written down, as the stages a rolling stone never sees pass beneath its wheels. For sometimes, just one single spark is enough to set off a great fire that engulfs everything in its path. And sometimes, a spark is just someone saying enough. That is the power of protest. That is why they change the world.